Would you still walk away if the face in front of you carried the price of saving someone else's life? The message sat on Madeline Brooks' phone for nearly 10 seconds before she erased it without sending. Instead, she stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bellamy House, one of Chicago's most elegant restaurants, where crystal chandeliers painted warm reflections across polished oak tables and soft jazz floated gently through the evening air. She had almost canceled twice already. Blind dates had never been her idea, but after months of relentless board meetings, investor calls, and lonely nights inside a luxury penthouse that felt far too quiet, she had finally agreed to let her older sister arrange one. She expected confidence. She expected charm. She expected someone polished enough to understand the complicated life of a Fortune 500 CEO. What she did not expect was the man standing near the hostess station, nervously smoothing the sleeve of a navy sport coat that had clearly been tailored years ago. Caleb Mercer looked ordinary until her eyes reached the left side of his face. A pale scar stretched from his temple across his cheek before fading near his jaw, impossible to ignore beneath the restaurant lights. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. Every instinct whispered that she should politely leave before he noticed her. She quietly reached for her purse beneath the table, already rehearsing an excuse about an emergency conference call, when the hostess approached him with a warm smile. Caleb thanked her, then glanced toward the dining room, searching carefully until his eyes met Madeline's. He smiled, not with confidence but with quiet kindness, the kind that expected nothing in return. He walked over without rushing. His posture was steady, his expression calm, as though he had already accepted whatever happened next. "Madeline?" he asked softly. "I'm Caleb. Thank you for giving tonight a chance." She forced a courteous smile, but disappointment tightened inside her chest. This was not the evening she had imagined. She had built billion-dollar companies by trusting first impressions, and every instinct urged her to leave before becoming emotionally invested. Caleb seemed to notice the hesitation in her eyes before she spoke a single word. Instead of pretending not to see it, he gave a gentle nod and quietly pulled out the chair across from her. "If you're thinking about leaving," he said with a small, understanding smile, "I won't blame you." His honesty caught her completely off guard. There was no bitterness. No resentment. No attempt to explain himself. Just simple acceptance. She slowly lowered her purse back beside her chair without fully understanding why. As they sat, a waiter poured sparkling water into crystal glasses while candlelight flickered gently between them. Caleb thanked the waiter by name after reading his name tag, then asked how his evening had been going. The young waiter blinked in pleasant surprise before answering with a genuine smile. Madeline noticed the exchange. Most executives she knew barely acknowledged servers. Caleb treated everyone in the room as though they mattered. It was a small detail, but somehow it lingered longer than the scar itself. Outside, light rain began tapping softly against the windows while downtown traffic drifted by beneath glowing streetlights. Inside, neither of them reached for the menu right away. Instead, an unexpected silence settled comfortably between them, not awkward, not forced, simply waiting. Madeline found herself studying the man she had nearly dismissed within seconds. The scar still demanded attention, yet the quiet dignity behind his eyes seemed to ask a far more difficult question than appearance ever could. And for the first time that evening, she wondered whether she had almost walked away from a story she did not yet understand. Before the story takes a turn, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me, do you think she should trust him? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's continue. Madeline lifted the menu more to gather her thoughts than to read it. Across the table, Caleb did the same, giving her the space she silently requested without making her feel uncomfortable. The jazz pianist in the corner eased into another familiar melody while conversations rose and fell around them like gentle waves. "You can ask," Caleb said after a moment, setting his menu aside with an easy smile. "Most people do." Madeline looked up, surprised. "Ask what?" "About the scar." She hesitated, embarrassed that he had read her thoughts so easily. "I was trying not to be rude." Caleb nodded. "That is kind of you." He did not offer another explanation, and somehow that restraint made her even more curious. Instead, he asked, "How was your day?" It was such an ordinary question that she almost laughed. Nobody had asked her that in months without expecting a business answer. "Busy," she admitted. "Board meeting. Quarterly forecasts. More meetings after that." Caleb smiled softly. "Sounds exhausting." "It is my normal." "Does your normal make you happy?" The question landed more heavily than she expected. Investors constantly asked about growth. Journalists asked about innovation. Employees asked about leadership. No one asked whether she was happy. She looked down at the candle between them before answering honestly. "Sometimes I cannot tell anymore." Caleb simply nodded, as though the answer deserved respect rather than advice. Their appetizers arrived, and the waiter thanked Caleb for remembering his name. Madeline noticed it again. Caleb looked people in the eye. He listened carefully. He never interrupted. Even when the waiter accidentally placed the wrong salad in front of him, Caleb smiled and said, "No worries. We all have long days." The young man apologized, relieved instead of embarrassed. Madeline watched the exchange with growing curiosity. She had spent years around executives who measured every interaction by status. Caleb seemed to measure people by something entirely different. "What do you do?" she finally asked. "I manage facilities and preservation at the National Military Heritage Museum outside the city." "You restore exhibits?" "Sometimes. Mostly I make sure history is treated with respect." She expected him to sound disappointed by such a modest career, but there was quiet pride in his voice. "And when I am not working," he added, "I am usually helping my daughter with science projects or trying to convince her that pancakes count as dinner only once a week." Madeline smiled before she realized she was smiling. "How old is she?" 8. "Her name is Lily. She believes every stray dog secretly belongs to someone who simply has not found it yet." Madeline laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even her. "She sounds optimistic." "She got that from her mother," Caleb answered gently. The warmth in his eyes dimmed for only a heartbeat before returning. He did not linger on sadness. He simply carried it with quiet grace. Madeline noticed there was no wedding ring, no bitterness, no attempt to earn sympathy. Only gratitude for the daughter who clearly meant everything to him. She leaned back slightly, studying the man she had almost dismissed within seconds of meeting him. His jacket was simple. His watch was inexpensive. His shoes had been polished carefully even though they had seen many years of use. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. Yet every word he spoke carried a calm confidence that could not be purchased. For the first time in a very long time, Madeline realized she had stopped wondering how quickly she could leave. Instead, she found herself wondering why a man with such gentle strength had remained alone for so long. The main courses arrived on warm white plates, but neither of them seemed particularly interested in the food. The conversation had quietly become more satisfying than the meal itself. Outside, the rain had grown steadier, turning the city lights beyond the windows into soft ribbons of gold and silver. Caleb carefully unfolded his napkin before taking a sip of water. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Madeline smiled. "You have earned at least one question. When nobody knows your title, who are you?" She blinked. It was another question that no one had ever asked her. At conferences she was introduced by achievements. Financial magazines measured her by revenue. Television hosts described her as one of the youngest chief executive officers in the technology industry. Yet this quiet man wanted to know who she was when all of that disappeared. She looked toward the rain for a long moment. "I used to paint," she admitted quietly. "Landscapes. Lakes. Barns. Old churches. I stopped years ago. Caleb tilted his head with genuine interest. Why? She gave a small shrug. Business kept winning. He smiled gently. Business usually does. Until one day it does not matter nearly as much as we thought. There was no criticism in his voice. Only understanding. Before she could respond, Caleb's phone vibrated once against the table. He glanced at the screen, and his expression immediately softened. Would you excuse me for just a moment? She nodded. He answered quietly. Hey, Peanut. His voice changed completely, becoming lighter, warmer, almost playful. Madeline looked away to give him privacy, but she could not help hearing pieces of the conversation. Yes, I remembered your hamster has a science quiz tomorrow. No, I did not forget the poster board. Mrs. Harper is staying until I get home. Brush your teeth before you start another chapter. I love you too. When he ended the call, he slipped the phone into his pocket with a peaceful smile that lingered several seconds longer than necessary. Everything okay? Madeline asked. Everything is perfect now, Caleb replied. She just wanted to make sure I remembered to bring home chocolate milk. Madeline laughed softly. That was the emergency. In the life of an 8-year-old, absolutely. They shared another smile. Something invisible had begun to shift between them. The distance that existed an hour earlier seemed to be quietly disappearing. Caleb reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of construction paper decorated with colorful marker drawings. She insisted I carry this tonight, he said with an embarrassed grin. Madeline accepted it carefully. Across the front, written in large uneven letters, were the words, "Good luck, Daddy." Beneath the message stood 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. She drew us before she even knew me, Madeline whispered. Caleb chuckled. She said every blind date deserves a happy ending. Madeline traced the edge of the paper with her fingertip, unexpectedly moved by such innocent hope. Just then an older couple passed their table on the way toward the exit. The gentleman paused. Smiled warmly at Caleb, and tipped his head with unmistakable respect. Good to see you again, Mr. Mercer. Caleb stood immediately to shake his hand. Likewise, sir. I hope your grandson is doing well. He is because of your encouragement, the older man replied sincerely before continuing toward the door with his wife. Madeline watched the exchange with growing curiosity. That had not sounded like ordinary politeness. It sounded like gratitude. As Caleb returned to his seat, he simply unfolded his napkin again as though nothing unusual had happened. He offered no explanation, and she noticed a quiet pattern emerging. Wherever they went, people seemed to recognize something about him that he never mentioned himself. The mystery surrounding the scar was no longer the only question occupying her mind. She had begun to wonder how many remarkable chapters of this gentleman's life remained completely invisible to anyone willing to judge only what they first saw. The dinner plates had been cleared away, leaving only the quiet glow of candlelight between them and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the restaurant. Madeline no longer noticed the passing time. For the first time in months, she had gone nearly 2 hours without checking the stock market, answering a text from her executive team, or glancing at her calendar. Caleb had a rare gift. He made the world slow down without asking anyone to stop. Do you ever miss painting? He asked gently. She smiled with a hint of surprise. You remembered. People usually remember what matters to them. She looked down at the untouched coffee cup. Every once in a while I drive past a little art store on the north side of the city. I always think about going in. What stops you? She laughed softly. My schedule. Caleb smiled. Schedules are excellent servants and terrible masters. Before she could answer, the restaurant manager emerged from the dining room and began greeting several guests personally. He exchanged handshakes, shared brief conversations, and eventually reached their table. The moment he saw Caleb, his expression brightened with unmistakable warmth. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Sincerely. It is wonderful to see you again." Caleb stood immediately. "Good evening, Daniel. Congratulations on the renovation. The dining room looks beautiful." Daniel smiled proudly. "Thank you. We finally finished it last month." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "My father still asks about you every Veterans Day. He says your advice changed his retirement." Caleb looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. "Your father already had everything he needed. I only reminded him of that." Daniel nodded with genuine appreciation before shaking Caleb's hand once more. "Dessert is on the house tonight. Please allow us that privilege." Caleb immediately began to object. "That is generous, but really, there is no need." Daniel shook his head. "Please. My family would be disappointed if I accepted no for an answer." After he walked away, Madeline turned toward Caleb with growing curiosity. "You know the manager?" Caleb shrugged lightly. "Not very well." She raised an eyebrow. "He sounded as though your families have known each other for years." Caleb smiled modestly. "Sometimes you meet people when they need someone to listen." He offered nothing more. No dramatic story. No explanation. No attempt to impress her. A few minutes later, the young waiter returned carrying 2 beautifully plated desserts. "Compliments of the house," he said with an unusually respectful smile. As he placed the plates on the table, he quietly added, "My grandfather still keeps your letter in his desk." Caleb looked genuinely surprised. "Your grandfather is Mr. Alvarez?" "Yes, sir." "How is he doing?" "Better every year." The waiter smiled gratefully. "He still says your words gave him hope after losing my grandmother." Caleb lowered his eyes for a moment. "Tell him I think about him often." The waiter nodded before walking away, leaving Madeline staring across the table in thoughtful silence. None of these people spoke about money. None mentioned business success or social influence. They spoke about kindness, encouragement, and quiet moments that had somehow remained unforgettable. Caleb broke the silence first. "I hope this is not making the evening awkward." She slowly shook her head. "No. It is doing exactly the opposite." He looked puzzled. She smiled gently. "I spend most of my life surrounded by people trying very hard to prove how important they are. Tonight I keep meeting people who seem determined to tell me how important you have been, and you are the only person in the room who refuses to explain why." Caleb looked down with a quiet smile that carried both humility and old memories. "The best parts of life usually belong to other people, not to us." Madeline studied him as the desserts rested untouched between them. The mystery surrounding him had become deeper than she could have imagined. Whatever story lay behind the scar, it was clearly only one chapter in a life that had quietly changed far more hearts than anyone could see. Madeline picked up her dessert fork but never took the first bite. The candle between them flickered softly as conversations drifted across the dining room, blending with the quiet piano music that had accompanied the evening from the very beginning. Caleb had just begun telling a funny story about Lily insisting that every pancake should be shaped like an animal when the front entrance opened again. An older gentleman in a dark blue blazer stepped inside, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture straight despite the passing years. He paused only briefly before his eyes settled on Caleb. His expression changed instantly from polite curiosity to heartfelt recognition. Without hesitation, he crossed the dining room. "Caleb Mercer," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth that several nearby guests looked over. Caleb stood immediately, smiling with genuine surprise. "Colonel Whitaker. It has been a long time." The older man ignored the formality and wrapped Caleb in a firm embrace. When they stepped apart, Colonel Whitaker kept both hands on Caleb's shoulders, studying him with the quiet affection of someone greeting family. "You look stronger than the last time I saw you," he said. Caleb chuckled softly. I have an 8-year-old daughter. She makes sure I stay active. The colonel laughed, then noticed Madeline standing beside the table. I hope I am not interrupting. Caleb smiled. Not at all. Colonel, this is Madeline Brooks. Madeline, this is Richard Whittaker. Madeline extended her hand politely. It is a pleasure to meet you. Before she could say another word, the colonel looked back at Caleb, his eyes lingering on the scar that crossed the left side of his face. He shook his head with quiet emotion. Every time I see that scar, I remember how close we came to losing one of the finest soldiers I ever had the honor to serve beside. The dining room seemed to grow quieter. Madeline felt her heartbeat slow as she looked from the colonel to Caleb. Caleb lowered his eyes modestly. Sir, that was a long time ago. Maybe, Colonel Whittaker replied gently, but gratitude does not expire. He turned toward Madeline with the calm sincerity of a man speaking from memory rather than ceremony. You are looking at a man who never talks about himself. That scar came from a bullet during an overseas deployment. It nearly took his life, but because he stayed where others needed him most, for young soldiers made it home to their families. Caleb's expression remained calm, almost uncomfortable with the attention. Colonel, please. The older man smiled kindly. You always did hate being recognized. Several nearby diners had fallen completely silent. Even the waiter who had served them moments earlier stopped for a respectful moment before quietly continuing his work. Madeline stared at Caleb, suddenly remembering the instant she had almost walked out of the restaurant because she had seen only the scar and nothing beyond it. Her throat tightened. The mark she had silently judged had never been a reason for shame. It was a reminder of courage, sacrifice, and a life devoted to protecting others before himself. Caleb slowly looked back at her, reading the emotion in her eyes before she found the words to speak. Instead of defending himself or accepting praise, he simply offered the same gentle smile he had worn from the beginning of the evening. I was fortunate, he said quietly. Many good people helped me come home. I have spent every day since then trying to live a life that honors them. Madeline lowered her eyes as tears gathered despite every effort to remain composed. The dessert sitting untouched between them suddenly seemed insignificant. She had arrived expecting to evaluate a stranger's appearance. Instead, she had discovered the extraordinary character of a man whose deepest strength had never been written across his face, but quietly carried within his heart. Colonel Whittaker rested one hand gently on Caleb's shoulder before offering a final nod of respect. It was good seeing you again, son, he said warmly. Do not stay away so long. Caleb smiled. I will try, sir. As the colonel quietly left the restaurant, the conversations around the room slowly returned, but something had undeniably changed. The atmosphere felt softer, almost reverent, as though everyone had briefly been reminded that the greatest stories often belong to the quietest people. Madeline remained silent, her dessert untouched. She looked across the table at Caleb, searching for words that suddenly seemed impossible to find. Why did you never tell me? She finally asked. Caleb folded his hands calmly on the table. Because that is not who I am now. She shook her head gently. It is still part of you. It is, he admitted. But it is not the part one hoped people remember first. The candlelight reflected softly across the scar on his face, and for the first time that evening, Madeline no longer saw it as something that interrupted his appearance. It had become part of a much larger story, one written with sacrifice, resilience, and quiet dignity. The colonel mentioned 4 soldiers, she said carefully. Caleb looked down for a moment before answering. They all came home. That is the part that matters. And you? He offered a small smile. I came home too. Just a little different than when I left. There was no trace of self-pity in his voice. Only gratitude. Madeline lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of her own assumptions. She remembered standing near the entrance earlier that evening, convincing herself she had enough experience to judge a person's character within seconds. She had spent years making difficult business decisions based on instinct, believing that first impressions rarely failed her. Tonight had quietly dismantled that certainty. "I owe you an apology," she whispered. Caleb looked genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For the way I looked at you when you walked in." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee before setting the cup back onto its saucer. "You are not the first person," he said gently. "And you probably will not be the last. That does not make it right." "No," he agreed softly. "But life teaches us in different ways. Sometimes kindness teaches us. Sometimes regret does." His words carried no accusation. They sounded more like lessons he had quietly collected over many years. Madeline felt another sting of emotion behind her eyes. "Does it ever hurt?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. Caleb lightly touched the edge of the scar with 2 fingers before letting his hand fall back to the table. "Only when the weather changes," he said with a faint smile. Then after a brief pause, he added, "The harder part was learning not to let it change how I saw myself." Madeline held his gaze. That sentence reached far deeper than anything she had expected to hear. It was not really about the scar. It was about identity, dignity, and refusing to let difficult chapters define an entire life. "What happened after you came home?" she asked quietly. Caleb looked toward the rain streaking gently across the windows. "I married the woman I had loved since college. We had Lily. A few beautiful years later, illness took my wife much sooner than either of us imagined. Suddenly I was learning how to braid little ponytails, pack school lunches, and explain to an 8-year-old why hope still mattered." His smile returned, tender but unmistakably real. "Lily became my mission after that." Madeline listened without interrupting. The successful chief executive officer who negotiated billion-dollar agreements suddenly felt very small beside a father whose greatest accomplishment was raising one little girl with love, humility, and courage. Somewhere between the untouched dessert and the cooling cups of coffee, she realized the evening had become something far greater than a blind date. It had become a quiet lesson about the difference between appearance and character, and she silently wondered how many extraordinary people she had overlooked simply because she had never stayed long enough to hear their story. The rain had finally slowed to a gentle mist by the time they stepped outside the restaurant. The sidewalks shimmered beneath the glow of old street lamps, and the cool evening air carried the comforting scent of fresh pavement after a summer shower. Neither of them seemed eager to end the night. They walked without speaking for several moments, their footsteps quiet against the damp sidewalk as the city moved gently around them. A street musician several yards away played a slow melody on a violin, filling the silence with something peaceful that words could not improve. Madeline stopped near the edge of a small park overlooking the river. She rested one hand lightly against the iron railing before turning toward Caleb. "Can I tell you something completely honest?" Caleb nodded. Honesty is usually the best place to begin. She took a slow breath. "When I first saw you tonight, I almost left." He looked at her calmly. There was no surprise in his expression because he had already known. "I figured." She lowered her eyes. "I looked at your face before I looked into your eyes. I decided who you were before you even reached the table." Caleb leaned lightly against the railing beside her. The river reflected hundreds of tiny lights, flowing quietly through the heart of the city as though reminding them that everything worth keeping moved patiently. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Madeline looked at him in disbelief. "That is all you are going to say?" He smiled gently. "What else should I say? You should probably tell me I was shallow." Caleb shook his head. "No. I think you were human." She laughed softly through tears that refused to disappear. "That almost sounds like forgiveness. Maybe it is understanding." He looked across the water before continuing. "People notice what is different. That is natural. What matters is whether they stay long enough to discover everything else. His words settled into her heart with remarkable gentleness. There was no anger. No lecture. No attempt to make her feel guilty. He simply offered grace where most people would have demanded an apology. You know, Madeline admitted quietly, I have spent years teaching young executives not to judge employees by appearances. Tonight I realized I failed my own lesson. Caleb smiled. The good thing about lessons is that we can always learn them tomorrow if we missed them yesterday. She wiped a tear from the corner of her eye and laughed again. How do you always know the right thing to say? He shrugged. I usually do not. Lily tells me when I get it wrong. That image made her smile even wider. She could almost picture the little girl confidently correcting her father with complete sincerity. They continued walking until they reached a small bench overlooking the river. Caleb sat first, leaving respectful space between them. Madeline sat beside him, noticing that the distance no longer felt necessary. Can I ask one more question? She said. Of course. After everything life has asked of you, how did you keep your heart this kind? Caleb looked toward the night sky where a few stars had begun appearing between the clouds. He answered slowly, choosing each word with care. Because Lily is watching. Every day she learns how to treat people by watching how I treat them. If I become bitter, she might believe bitterness is strength. I would rather teach her that kindness survives even when life becomes difficult. Madeline felt tears return, not from sadness this time, but from admiration. She had built companies that employed thousands of people, yet sitting beside this quiet father, she realized she was listening to the kind of leader every boardroom hoped to find but almost never did. The man she had nearly rejected because of a scar had quietly revealed a character more remarkable than any accomplishment printed on a resume, and somewhere deep inside her heart she knew this evening had already changed the way she would see people for the rest of her life. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in bright sunshine and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of fresh cut grass through Lincoln Park. Madeline had not expected to feel nervous. She had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without losing her composure, yet waiting beside the park fountain for Caleb and his daughter somehow felt far more important. She checked her watch, then smiled as she spotted them walking along the tree-lined path. Caleb wore a simple light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, while a little girl with golden brown hair skipped beside him, holding his hand with complete confidence. The moment Lily noticed Madeline, she looked up at her father with wide curious eyes. Is that her? She whispered loudly enough for both adults to hear. Caleb laughed softly. Yes, Peanut. That is Madeline. Lily hurried forward before either adult could say another word. Hi, she said with a bright smile. Daddy said you used to paint pictures. Madeline blinked, pleasantly surprised. I did. Lily held up a small paper gift bag decorated with colorful stickers. Then I made something for you. Madeline knelt so they were eye level before carefully opening the bag. Inside was a brand new watercolor sketchbook tied with a blue ribbon beside a small handwritten note. In careful childish handwriting it read, Daddy says people should never stop doing what makes their heart smile. I hope you paint again. Love, Lily. Madeline felt her throat tighten. She looked toward Caleb, who appeared almost embarrassed. She insisted, he explained quietly. She thought everyone deserved encouragement. Madeline looked back at Lily. This is one of the sweetest gifts I have ever received. Lily grinned proudly. Daddy says presents do not have to cost a lot if they remind someone they matter. Those simple words settled gently into the afternoon air. They spent the next hour walking through the park, watching ducks glide across the lake while Lily eagerly pointed out every squirrel, flower bed, and butterfly she could find. At one point she tugged Madeline toward an old oak tree where children had covered a nearby fence with colorful ribbons carrying handwritten wishes. You have to make one, Lily insisted. Madeline accepted a ribbon from her with a smile. What should I wish for? Lily thought very seriously before answering. Maybe do not wish for more work. Caleb laughed under his breath. That is excellent advice. Madeline smiled as she wrote only 3 simple words on the ribbon. More time living. She tied it gently beside dozens of others fluttering in the breeze. Caleb read the words without commenting, but the quiet smile on his face told her he understood exactly what they meant. Later they stopped at a neighborhood ice cream stand where Lily spent several minutes trying to decide between chocolate and strawberry before confidently announcing that mixing both flavors was the obvious solution. As they sat together beneath a large maple tree, Madeline watched Caleb patiently wipe a small streak of ice cream from Lily's cheek while the little girl giggled without the slightest embarrassment. It was such an ordinary moment, yet it carried more warmth than the most extravagant dinner she had ever attended. Watching them together, Madeline realized she was no longer seeing Caleb only as the remarkable man she had met days earlier. She was seeing the gentle father his daughter already believed was the strongest and kindest person in the world. And somewhere between a watercolor sketchbook, a ribbon tied to an old fence, and 2 scoops of melting ice cream, Madeline quietly discovered that the future she had spent years chasing suddenly seemed far less meaningful than the simple joy of belonging beside 2 hearts that had already taught her what success truly looked like. 6 months passed with surprising quietness, not because life had become easier, but because the 3 of them had slowly learned to carry it together. Madeline still led board meetings and signed important contracts, yet she no longer measured success only by numbers printed in quarterly reports. Several evenings each week were now reserved for watercolor lessons with Lily at the kitchen table while Caleb prepared dinner nearby, occasionally laughing as bright blue paint somehow found its way onto both of their sleeves. The sketchbook Lily had given Madeline was nearly full. Lakes, barns, old churches, city parks, and one page after another filled with simple moments that money could never purchase. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the National Military Heritage Museum hosted its annual Community Appreciation Ceremony honoring veterans, volunteers, teachers, and families who had quietly served others throughout the year. Caleb had planned to stand near the back, just another member of the museum staff helping guests find their seats. That plan lasted only until the museum director stepped onto the stage and unexpectedly invited him forward. The audience applauded warmly as Caleb hesitated before walking toward the podium with the same humility that had defined every conversation Madeline had ever shared with him. Lily squeezed Madeline's hand. "Daddy gets embarrassed when people clap for him," she whispered proudly. Madeline smiled. "I know." Instead of delivering the scheduled introduction herself, the museum director looked toward Madeline in the front row. "Miss Brooks," she said with a warm smile, "there is someone here who asked whether you might say a few words instead." Madeline looked surprised, then slowly stood. As she approached the microphone, hundreds of faces turned toward her. Caleb quietly shook his head with an amused smile, clearly unaware of what she intended to say. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "The first time I met Caleb Mercer, I noticed one thing before anything else. I noticed a scar." The room grew completely still. I almost allowed that first impression to become my final decision. I believed I understood someone's story after only a few seconds. She paused, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I could not have been more mistaken. She looked toward Caleb, whose eyes reflected the same quiet kindness they had carried from the beginning. "That scar taught me something I should have learned years ago. Real beauty is not perfection. Real beauty is courage that remains humble, kindness that asks for nothing in return, and dignity that never needs applause." She smiled gently. "The scar I almost feared became the reason I finally understood what true character looks like." Silence filled the auditorium for a heartbeat before gentle applause slowly spread through the room. It grew louder, not because anyone had been told to clap, but because gratitude often begins quietly before it reaches every heart nearby. Caleb lowered his eyes with his familiar modest smile, never seeking attention even as it surrounded him. Lily slipped her small hand into his and whispered, "I told you people would like you." He laughed softly and kissed the top of her head. That was never the important part, Peanut. She looked up curiously. Then what is? Caleb glanced toward Madeline as she stepped down from the stage and walked back to them. Finding people who see your heart before they judge your story. Madeline reached them with tears shining gently in her eyes. Without saying a word, Lily took one of Madeline's hands while holding tightly to her father's with the other. Together they walked out of the museum beneath rows of American flags moving peacefully in the autumn breeze, not as three people whose lives have been rescued by dramatic miracles, but as one family quietly transformed by grace, second chances, and the simple decision to stay long enough to truly see another human being. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more emotional stories like this. And before you go, what state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. See you in the next story.